I'm Michele Magwood, and I'm absolutely honored to be able to introduce you to Arundhati Roy here tonight. I was just saying to her that in all the years I've been doing this, I've never seen such a huge crowd for an author, and I think that it's testament to your power as a writer, Arundhati, that everybody wants to hear you. I'm going to get the practical stuff out of the way first. Arundhati is asked to do a reading, which she will do shortly. We'll follow that with a discussion. We'll open it up to the floor, so you get a chance to ask your own questions. And Arundhati will finish off with another short reading. Please do tweet the event tonight. It's the hashtag Arundhati Roy essay. And before we get going, I want to steer you to the most beautiful, short, evocative film on the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which is up on the Penguin Random House website, and I advise you to go and watch. It's a short film. It's narrated by Arundhati herself, and it's just beautiful. It's got graveyards, and it's got white horses, and it's got birds, and it's the most amazing atmosphere. So have a look on the website for that. And of course, this discussion, now that it's finally going, and you can hear me, is also going to be available on the website tomorrow. So I don't think I need to tell you that Arundhati's debut novel, The God of Small Things, won the Man Booker Prize. I don't think I need to tell you. But it was a very, very long 20 years that we've waited for her second novel, which is The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. So, Arundhati, I feel in a way that many of us here, we've grown up with you. We've kind of grown older with you, not old, because the God of Small Things changed us in some way, and I think that the Ministry of Utmost Happiness is changing us again. And again, that's testament to your power. I don't know of another writer in the world who has the powers of description that Arundhati has, who has the beauty of writing that Arundhati has, but who fuels her writing with such a rage, with such a boiling, boiling fury. And now I'm going to ask you to do your reading. Welcome again. Set the scene for us, Arundhati.
Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Before I start, I want to say that I know today is the anniversary of the Marikana massacre. And also today, Aretha Franklin died. So we remember these things which are always a part of our lives, our love, our anger. I woke up this morning and watched TV, and I was a little envious of the fact that TV in South Africa shows the massacre, talks about it, and discusses it. We have many such massacres happening more than once in every 6 years, perhaps twice a year, but somehow our media rarely talks about it anymore, maybe because a lot of them owned by the mining companies. So the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, it's a hard, complex book. If the God of Small Things was a house or a building, this is a city. I did want to screen the 6-minute film, but we couldn't because it shows you the landscapes through which the book ranges, which, when I read from a particular section, is hard to do. But I'm going to read from a section which is set in Kashmir, which is the northern part of India that doesn't want to be a part of India, which is one of the densest military occupations in the world, where since the 1990s there's been a militant and armed uprising. So this chapter is called The Untimely Death of Miss Jibin I. Ever since she was old enough to insist, she had insisted on being called Miss Jibin. It was the only name she would answer to. Everyone had to call her that. her parents, her grandparents, the neighbors too. She was a precocious devotee of the Miss fetish that gripped the Kashmir Valley in the early years of the insurrection. All of a sudden, fashionable young ladies, especially in the towns, insisted on being addressed as Miss. Miss Momin, Miss Ghazala, Miss Farhana. It was only one of the many fetishes of the times. In those blood-dimmed years, for reasons nobody fully understood, the people became what can only be described as fetish-prone. Other than the Miss fetish, there was a nurse fetish, a PT instructor fetish, and a roller skating fetish. So, in addition to checkposts, bunkers, weapons, grenades, landmines, cassipiers, concertina wire, soldiers, insurgents, counterinsurgents, spies, special operatives, double agents, triple agents, and suitcases from either side, from agencies on both sides of the border. The valley was also awash with nurses, PT instructors, and roller skaters. And of course, Misses. Among them, Miss Jabin, who didn't live long enough to become a nurse, nor even a roller skater. In the Mazar-e-Shahada, the martyr's graveyard, where she was first buried, the cast iron signboard that arched over the main gate said in 2 languages, "We gave our todays for your tomorrows." It's corroded now, the green paint faded, the delicate calligraphy flecked with pinholes of light. Still, there it is, after all these years, silhouetted like a swatch of stiff lace against the sapphire sky and the snowy, saw-toothed mountains. There it still is. Miss Jabin and her mother were buried along with the 15 others, taking the toll of their massacre to 17. At the time of their funeral, the Mazar-e-Shuhada was still fairly new, but was already getting crowded. However, the Intizamiya Committee, the organizing committee, had its ear to the ground from the very beginning of the insurrection and had a realistic idea of things to come. It planned the layout of the graves carefully, making ordered, efficient use of the available space. Everybody understood how important it was to bury martyrs' bodies in collective burial grounds and not leave them scattered in their thousands like bird feed up in the mountains or in the forests around the army camps and torture centers that had mushroomed across the valley. When the fighting began and the occupation tightened its grip, for ordinary people, the consolidation of their dead became in itself an act of defiance. Martyrdom stole into the Kashmir Valley from across the line of control through moonlit mountain passes manned by soldiers. Night after night, it walked on narrow, stony paths wrapped like thread around blue cliffs of ice, across vast glaciers and high meadows of waist-deep snow. It trudged past young boys shot down in snowdrifts, their bodies arranged in eerie, frozen tableaus under the pitiless gaze of the pale moon in the cold night sky, and stars that hung so low you felt you could almost touch them. When it arrived in the valley, it stayed close to the ground and spread through the walnut groves, the saffron fields, the apple, almond, and cherry orchards like a creeping mist. It whispered words of war into the ears of doctors and engineers, students and laborers, tailors and carpenters, weavers and farmers, shepherds, cooks, and bards. They listened carefully and then put down their books and implements, their needles, their chisels, their staffs, their plows, their cleavers, and their spangled clown costumes. They stilled the looms on which they had woven the most beautiful carpets and the finest, softest shawls the world had ever seen, and ran gnarled, wandering fingers over the smooth barrels of Kalashnikovs that the strangers who visited them allowed them to touch. They followed the new Pied Pipers up into the high meadows and alpine glades where training camps had been set up. Only after they had been given guns of their own, after they had curled their fingers around the trigger and felt it give ever so slightly, after they had weighed the odds and decided it was a viable option, only then did they allow the rage and shame of the subjugation they had endured for decades, for centuries, to course through their bodies and turn the blood in their veins into smoke. The mist swirled on an indiscriminate recruitment drive. It whispered into the ears of black marketeers, bigots, thugs, and confidence tricksters. They too listened intently before they reconfigured their plans. They ran their sly fingers over the cold metal bumps on their quota of grenades that was being distributed so generously like parcels of choice mutton at Eid. They grafted the language of God and freedom, Allah and Azadi, onto their murders and new scams. They made off with money, property, and women. Of course, women. Women, of course. In this way, the insurrection began. Death was everywhere. Death was everything. Career, desire, dream, poetry, love, youth itself. Dying became just another way of living. Graveyards sprang up in parks and meadows, by streams and rivers, in fields and forest glades. Tombstones grew out of the ground like young children's teeth. Every village, every locality had its own graveyard. The ones that didn't grew anxious about being seen as collaborators. In the remote border areas near the line of control, the speed and regularity with which the bodies turned up and the condition some of them were in wasn't easy to cope with. Some were delivered in sacks, some in small polythene bags, some just pieces of flesh, some hair and teeth. Notes pinned to them by the quartermasters of death said 1 kilo, 2.7 kilos, 500 grams. Tourists flew out, journalists flew in, honeymooners flew out, soldiers flew in. Women flocked around police stations and army camps, holding up a forest of thumbed, dog-eared, passport-sized photographs grown soft with tears. Please, sir, have you seen my boy anywhere? Have you seen my husband? Has my brother by any chance passed through your hands? And the sirs swelled their chests and bristled their mustaches and played with their medals and narrowed their eyes to assess them, to see which one's despair would be worth converting into corrosive hope. I'll see what I can do. And what that hope would mean to whom? A fee, a feast, a fuck, a truckload of walnuts. Prisons filled up, jobs evaporated. Guides, touts, pony owners and their ponies, bellboys, waiters, receptionists, toboggan pullers, trinket sellers, florists, and the boatmen on the lake grew poorer and hungrier. Only for the grave diggers there was no rest. It was just work, 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 with no extra pay for overtime or night shifts. In the Mazar-e-Shohada, Miss Jabin and her mother were buried next to each other. On his wife's tombstone, Musa Yesvi wrote, Arifa Yesvi, 12 September 1968 to 22nd December 1995. And below that, Ab wahan khak udhati hai kiza, phool hi phool jahan the pehle. Now dust blows on autumn's breeze where once were flowers, only flowers. Next to it, on Miss Jabin's tombstone, it said, Miss Jabin, 2nd January 1992 to 22nd December 1995. And then right at the bottom, in very small letters, Musa asked the tombstone engraver to inscribe what many would consider an inappropriate epitaph for a martyr. He positioned it in a place where he knew that in winter it would be more or less hidden under the snow, and during the rest of the year, tall grass and wild narcissus would obscure it, more or less. And this is what he wrote. Ach, dalilawan, yet mans nakan balai asi, na sukuni jungles mans rozan. It's what Miss Jabeen would say to him at night as she lay next to him on the carpet, resting her back on a frayed velvet bolster, wearing her own ferran, tiny as a tea cozy, Firozi blue with salmon pink paisleys embroidered around the neck and sleeves, and mimicking precisely her father's lying down posture, her left leg bent, her right angle on her left knee, her very small fist in his very big one. Ach, Dalila one, tell me a story. And then she would begin the story herself, shouting it out into the somber, curfewed night, her raucous delight dancing out of the windows and rousing the neighborhood. Yet mans nakan balai asi, na asukuni janglas mans rozan. There wasn't a witch, and she didn't live in the jungle. Can you tell me a story, and can we cut the crap about the witch and the jungle? Can you tell me a real story? Cold soldiers from a warm climate, patrolling the icy highway that circled their neighborhood, cocked their ears and uncocked the safety catches of their guns. Who's there? What's that sound? Stop, or we'll shoot. They came from far away and did not know words in Kashmiri for stop or shoot or who. They had guns, so they didn't need to. The youngest of them, S. Murgeson, barely adult, had never been so cold, had never seen snow, and was still enchanted by the shapes his breath made as it condensed in the frozen air. Look, he said, on his first night patrol, 2 fingers to his lips, pulling on an imaginary cigarette, exhaling a plume of blue smoke. Free cigarette. The white smile in his dark face floated through the night and then faded, deflated by the bored disdain of his mates. Go ahead, they said to him, smoke the whole pack. Cigarettes don't taste so good once they've blown your head off. They did get to him eventually. The armored jeep he was driving in was blown up on the highway just outside Kupwara. He and 2 soldiers bled to death by the side of the road. In his village, the Vaniyars, who were not untouchable, would not allow the body of S. Murugesan, who was, to be carried past their houses to the cremation ground. So the funeral procession took a circuitous route that skirted the village to the separate, untouchables cremation ground, right next to the village dump. To commemorate S. Murugesan's valor, the army contributed towards building a cement statue of Sepoy S. Murugesan in his soldier's uniform with his rifle on his shoulder at the entrance of the village. Every now and then, his young widow would point it out to their baby, who was 6 months old when her father died. Appa, she'd say, waving at the statue. And the baby would smile, mimicking precisely her mother's wave, a fold of baby fat spilling over her baby wrist like a bracelet. Appa, 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 she'd say, smiling. But not everyone in the village was happy with the idea of having an untouchable man's statue being put up at the entrance, particularly not an untouchable who carried a weapon. They felt it would give out the wrong message, give people ideas. 3 weeks after the statue went up, the rifle on its shoulder went missing. Sepoy S. Murugesan's family tried to file a complaint, but the police refused to register a case, saying that the rifle must have fallen off or simply disintegrated due to the use of substandard cement, a fairly common malpractice, and that nobody could be blamed. A month later, the statue's hands were cut off. Once again, the police refused to register a case, although this time they sniggered knowingly and did not even bother to offer a reason. 2 weeks after the amputation of its hands, the statue of Sepoy S. Murugesan was beheaded. There were a few days of tension. People from nearby villages who belonged to the same caste as S. Murugesan organized a protest. A local court said it would constitute a magisterial committee to look into the matter. In the meanwhile, it ordered a status quo. In some countries, some soldiers died twice. The headless statue remained at the entrance of the village, though it no longer bore any likeness to the man it was supposed to commemorate. It turned out to be a more truthful emblem of the times than it would otherwise have been. S. Murugesan's baby continued to wave at him, "Appa, Appa, Appa." Thank you.
I feel as if everything comes together of your writing in that particular reading that you chose, the horror, absurdity, despair, violence, the unspeakable, but also, finally, a glimpse still of life, and a glimpse still of life unfolding. Why did you choose that particular passage?
I chose it because I thought that here you would understand it better than most, you know, how layered the violence is in India, and how caste is a living and functioning form of apartheid, not color-coded as clearly as it was here, but coded in ways in which it's not just something that is, you know, it's even given divine sanction. It's something that has existed for thousands of years, something that has been modernized and exists today. And you know, to me, after writing The God of Small Things, and after the 20 years of writing politically, I could not be satisfied with a simple story, you know, because the understanding of the violence that is perpetuated in the name of democracy and secularism in Kashmir that we are meant to digest and approve of, the violence of caste, the violence of gender, and the beauty and the poetry and the tenderness that all exist side by side. Only if you can put these together, because this is the air we breathe in India, only together do they constitute a radical understanding. You can't divide them up into NGO funding headlines and then write novels set exploring these particular subject heads, because somehow and somewhere they all constitute the air we breathe. And this is a book about the air
that we breathe. Because I think we in the West, or as we are here in the South, I think we have a skewed filter through which we see India, or which I think India wants to be seen, and that is the filter of color and music and food and Bollywood and the Taj Mahal and the Marigold Hotel.
Gandhi.
But what you're saying is that it's all messed up. It's all mixed up together.
Well, what I'm saying is that there is a sense in which, you know, viewed at from the outside, you're looking at an exuberant, anarchic, vibrant, sort of spiritual society. But in truth, in India, people live in a grid of caste, of a mesh, if you like, of a vertical hierarchy of caste. Any transgression is met with huge violence, not by the state, but by society itself, by the parents of the children who choose to transgress sometimes. It's not just caste, but now, of course, any connection between Hindus and Muslims is met with violence, of ethnicity, of all of that, and there is very little anarchy, in fact, in how society organizes itself. And Bollywood is interesting because, it is a utopia of castelessness, of love, of passion and romance in a society that doesn't practice that. It isn't a society. In Bollywood films, you rarely have surnames, and sometimes, you don't know what castes people are quite often. But that is not so in society, So it's almost so exciting because it is not what is really happening.
It's all going on under the surface, is what you're saying. You remind us that, chillingly, that Marikanas happen in India regularly, much more regularly, and they aren't reported on. I want to ask you, and having read and listened to that passage again, and there's several passages in the ministry that are that, powerful. How do you bear it as a writer? And I say bear meaning burden, or bear witness. How are you able to look at that as you do and take it on?
Well, I don't see myself as bearing it so much as living in it with a lot of other people, And I think when you're inside it, you're also inside the battles, you're also inside the dark humor, the often vulgar humor, the choicelessness of being in those situations, And to me, in a sense, there is an exhilaration to being a writer whose work is like it's not arbitrated by festivals and critics and so on. There's a direct connection between what's going on, what is being written, what angers people, you feel very much part of a very live debate, a very live battle, nothing is settled, and huge things are being fought for there. Huge things. I mean, the battles for civilization and the meaning of progress and development, the definitions of these things are being fought for. In the forests of central India, there's a guerrilla war, but it's not it's a war to pleading for a different way of looking at a mountain. You see the corporations look at a bauxite mountain and they calculate how much bauxite there is in there and how much profit can be got and how much percentage the government should have and so on. Whereas the people who are fighting to preserve the mountain see it as a porous water tank that keeps the water in there, that waters fields for miles around, that sustains life for miles around, that cannot be calculated by punching in numbers on a computer, So it's exhilarating. It's not a burden. It would be a burden if you just saw only horror and only violence, but actually you see and live in the range of everything there. And you can't fight for things with any ferocity unless you love things with an equal ferocity,
True. Arundhati, you could have taken the Man Booker Prize and run with it. You could have stayed home and written another novel in 2 or 3 years, and you didn't. Instead, you've used your voice, as you say, to speak out and write out, and your royalties. You use your royalties for the causes that are close to your heart. And Be more specific about those causes that are so close to your heart.
You know, theoretically, it sounds as if I could have, spent my life writing a novel every few years and living in the literary salons of the world, but I couldn't have. It wasn't a choice for me, you know. It was never on the cards. It was never something I was going to do, regardless of the Booker Prize or not, or whatever, you know. It wasn't, I mean, I'm not a person who makes choices. I just am someone who lives by instinct, you know. Very soon after The God of Small Things was published, the Hindu nationalist government came to power, conducted a series of nuclear tests, and I really didn't have a choice because I was at that time being pushed forward as the face of this new right-wing rising nuclear power, and I didn't want to be that. I had to step off that train, and stepping off it led to 20 years of whatever I did, you know. And I never imagined that a book, a novel, could even be materially as successful as The God of Small Things was. And I was quite uncomfortable about, being paid for my work in this, in money of the kind that I never ever thought about, you know. But for me, it was always to be shared. You know, one of the most beautiful moments for me was a friend of mine who's a painter, and we were both we were both classmates in architecture school, both completely broke. And he had a letter from me when after college saying, "Hey, Golu, I'm completely broke. Can you give me 2,000 rupees? When I'm rich, I'll give you lots." So his first reaction to, what happened with the money was, "Hey, Roy, we are rich. We are rich," you know. And I loved that because that's what I felt. And I feel that money is a dangerous thing even when you give it away, but because I'm involved with so many things, which I don't see as causes, by the way. I don't see as causes. I see it as politics, as a way of seeing, as people who are involved in battles which I am completely in solidarity with. So it is to be shared, and shared responsibly. So there are many of us who are involved in seeing to it that it is done responsibly and not thrown at people just to make yourself feel good about yourself, you know. So that's hard work, but.
What do you think it is or was about the God of Small Things that touched us so universally around the world, millions and millions? What is it about that story?
Well, I don't think we'll ever know. I don't really spend a lot of time trying to think about that, because I think art or music or literature, there's something so magical and so esoteric about it. You'll never ever know what is it about a piece of writing or a piece of music that suddenly travels around the world and touches people's hearts. I don't think it has a rational explanation, and I don't even want to know.
No, you don't even want to know. What is known is that the book has echoes of your own life and your own upbringing. And I'm interested in knowing what it was that catapulted you out of that village, what you had read, studied, that showed you that there was another world and that you wanted it.
Kerala is where I come from, which is currently almost underwater, big floods there. my mother belongs to a community called the Syrian Christians who believed that they were converted to Christianity by St. Thomas in the 1st century AD. And my mother, it's a very small parochial and entitled community. And she married outside. She married, my father was from Bengal, way on the other side of India, and then had 2 children and got divorced, and came back to the village to a extremely hostile environment where, it was just not done that you first marry outside, then you get divorced, and you come back with these 2 completely unwanted children. So my brother and I we grew up just constantly being told, like, why are you here, and why don't you leave, and so on. And me being told that no one will marry you, etc. Not ever asking whether I wanted to marry them, but that was a separate matter. So from a very young, and my mother is one of the most remarkable women I know. I mean, it's not that we get on that well. We're like a pair of nuclear powers in the same room. Whenever people ask me about her, I say she's like someone who escaped from the sets of a Fellini film. But my mother started a school, and initially in the village, my grandmother did run a pickle factory. I did grow up in a pickle factory and in a school. And she used to experiment on me. I was a sort of pilot party, So I in a way, I didn't have an orthodox education until I was about 10 when I was sent away to another school. But I knew from the time I was very young that I couldn't live in this community. There wasn't a future for me there, not because I came from the most oppressed caste or not because of, it's just that I didn't have a community. It was clear that you were outside it. So very much like Esteban and Rahel, you have to keep trying to understand and decode things for yourself. And so I knew that I had to leave the minute I could. And one of the reasons that I decided to study architecture was that I knew that I could start earning, while I was in first year, because you learn to draw and I could work in architects' offices. And so I more or less left home when I was 16 and never went back.
I was just looking for a quote here. In the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, I think of her as Tilo, but she might be Tilo. One of her friends describes her, and they say, she gave the impression that she'd somehow slipped off her leash, as though she was taking herself for a walk, while the rest of us were being walked like pets. That kind of reminds me of you. Has sort of slipped off your leash. But let's talk more about the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. It is, if you haven't read it yet, and I'm sure you will after listening to Arundhati, it's a great, big, baggy, sprawling mansion of a book. It's got rivers, it's got byways, it's got deltas. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. You told me that, and it took you 10 years to write, and you told me that the characters came and lived with you. They took up home with you.
Yeah, I mean, I had always said that, I wasn't going to write another novel unless there was another novel to write. And over the years, as I traveled to Kashmir, to the valley where the dams were being built, gradually things started to build up in me. And it was almost like, for me, I see the structure of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness as you would see a gigantic metropole in my part of the world, with an ancient part and a modern part and the, alleyways and highways. And so the idea was not that a reader could consume the book, but that a reader would be consumed by it, would get lost in it, would have to live in it, would maybe have to read it several times, which is not a smart thing to say today, but to me it was important that it just doesn't slip down your throat, And it was almost as though I did want to write something where I just didn't want to write a book where there were these few characters and their lives play out against the background, but sometimes the background becomes the foreground. The people in the cities, as you travel and look at the politics of the displacement from dams, the displacement by mines, the security guard guarding the Honda City poster. He's not just a security guard. You know the story, you know where it comes from. And I didn't want to, I wanted even the smallest characters to have names and stories, and you'd have to stop and smoke a cigarette with them and listen and then move on, however confusing it was, And almost like walking down these streets, suddenly Anjum or Tilotoma or Musa would catch your eye, and then you'd meet them again, and then they'd drop in on you, and then they just moved in on me, And I really felt like, even though I live on my own, I felt I was living with this. In fact, I feel they are here now. They all have opinions. When people would come to meet me, it's almost like I'd shut the door and turn around, and they'd all have opinions about what had been said and what had been done. And so I did need to live with them for many years before I could write about them in the way I have,
They were squabbling for your attention. But Arundhati, how did you control such a complex story? And I'm talking here about the actual writing process, because I know many people in the audience are interested in the writing process. How to keep control of that? I mean, did you have charts? Did you have, sort of sub-stories and characters and that sort of thing?
No, I didn't. But to me, writing a novel, as important as the language is in this case, and the story is the structure. And even if the Ministry of Utmost Happiness gives the impression of being a sprawling book, in truth it isn't, or the sprawlingness is designed, and if you read it, you'll see that there is I did study urban planning. My architecture thesis was the post-colonial city. And to me, it's almost like the first few years were generating the smoke, the material that you're going to write with. And the next few years are molding it, And it isn't anything, it isn't that I had charts but everything, I was just obsessed with it. Like, it was just like a very, very complex mobile in my head. And to the point where, the last few years when I was writing it, I could barely appear normal, Whenever someone came to see me, they were talking to me, and I was just looking in their eyes earnestly, but telling myself, be normal, be normal, be normal.
Okay, I think it's time to open up this discussion to the floor.
Yeah, sure.
Could we have some house lights on, please, so that we can see who has a hand raised?
I've listened and watched a lot of your interviews, and I've been racking my brains as to what I should ask you, because in all your appearances, people generally tend to ask you the same things, so I wanted something different from you. So my question today is, with regards to your work in literature, what is the one question that you have never been asked, but you wish you have been asked, and what is the answer to that question? Thank you.
How many chilies can you eat? Many, many, many.
Who has the microphone?
Hi, I'm Pearl Pillay. So my question is less about the fictional writing and more about the political writing. So you're in obviously a very hectic political climate right now, and I first want to say that it's a bit bizarre that the moderator is not really representative of the politics of this country. It's a bit strange. So I just needed to register a sense of discomfort towards that. But what I want to ask is, in your writing, in your political writing, how do you balance the kind of privileged colonial lens that's always applied to your work from the outside with having to tell real political stories?
Well, the thing is that it's a very good question. And one of the things that happened after I wrote The God of Small Things was this invitation, to be a person who sort of interprets the East to the West, who writes in the big, Western newspapers and so on. And it was an invitation that I turned down. And I decided that I would stay there, I would argue there, I would fight there, and write about very specific battles that were happening there. And there was a moment when even that was, even that can become exoticized, as the sort of fierce voice in the third world country. And then 9/11 happened. And I was like, okay, now let's go for it, And I wrote The Algebra of Infinite Justice, which was about American imperialism and the war, and it went on, to the attack on Iraq and so on. And then you very quickly position yourself with your real politics, which then becomes a little bit frightening to that world. But don't forget that India in itself is an imperial power, And when you write about caste, for example, when you write about what is really going on, it's not that simple to separate who is the imperial power in today's economy and how it works, The Indian upper caste and elite are totally fused with international capital. So we've got to understand how we break down on whose side what is being fought, So one of the things I keep saying is the most successful secessionist struggle in India has been the secession of the middle and upper classes into outer space, where they look down and say, what's our water doing in their forests? What's our land doing in their villages, And there are things, to me, I'm always surprised, since I've actually only ever lived in India. I've not studied outside or lived outside. So when I go out, I get a little surprised at how many people show up, because I feel I'm just someone who writes about there mostly, and fights there. But there are things which are deeply disturbing. For example, I'm not going to get into the details, but for example, the whole industry that has grown around Gandhi, and whose side was he really on, And what are the people who protect that quite falsified legacy? And if you write about it, it becomes a problem for the Indian elite too, So these are complex things, and even when people on the TV shows in India who have turned into lynch mobs, who decide who should be killed, who should be vilified, who is a real Indian, who is not. When you're up against people like that, they decide who is the writer that is loved, who is the one that should be trolled. So you can only feel the pulse when I mean, I keep telling people that, I can go to a village in Punjab and 5,000 Sikh farmers will show up. So you can't say that I'm the hated writer, because that's the elite that hate you, And they are, I mean, India has not, and it's not even the elite. I mean, I'm just saying it's a certain power structure, So there has not been a day since independence when the Indian army has not been deployed against its own people within its own borders. So you have Assam, Manipur, Nagaland, Kashmir, Junagadh, Hyderabad, Punjab, Chhattisgarh now, and the armed forces, I mean paramilitary army or whatever. And when you look at who those people are, who the violence has been trained on, they are indigenous people, they are Christians, they are Muslims, they are Dalits, they are communists. So you have at heart an upper caste state continuously at war with the other, So how these lines work and pan out are complicated. And we have to understand how capitalism works, how it wants to divide people, isolate people, and continue pushing across borders, So all of these are subjects that I've written a lot about.
Thank you.
The last time we spoke, you were at the time of the writer, and I interviewed you on SAFM. I don't know if you remember that, but my name is Eric.
Hi.
I have two questions. One is a question of style. I think more than any other writer I've read, you use a lot of lists. Even in the passage that you read now, I think you had two lists. One had insurgents, counterinsurgents, spies, double spies, triple spies, and the other one had bellboys. I'd like you to explain just your use of lists, what you tried to do with them. I have my ideas, but it would be nice to hear it from you. The second one is a question of ideology. There's a very prominent writer here journalist called Anton Haber, and he wrote what a lot of people think is a very good book called Exclude, and it's about poor people, and it takes the applied forward, and I guess it's progressive in a way, I'm not sure. And I said I wouldn't read it because I grew up with that, and I'd like him to write a book called Sentin, because the people in Diepsloot, Sentin is a very rich area, Diepsloot being a squatter camp, because maybe a book about Sentin in the squatter camps might help them get out of the squatter camps. But it might not be right. What I'm saying is both worlds are real, but we choose which world to represent. And the world you've chosen, in a sense, is suicidal, because if you win, you will be unnecessary. So could you tell us, why you've chosen that side of things?
Let me answer the second question first. First of all, Kashmir is not a very poor place. Actually, Kashmir is people in Kashmir are materially better off than many places in India. And in fact, there's a part in this book where, the Indian migrants into Kashmir are the laborers, And it's a very odd situation where you have a fair-skinned people who feel colonized by a darker-skinned people. And the representatives of the colonial nation are actually poorer than the colonized. But, to me, the important thing in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, it is not about only poor people. In fact, one of the major chapters and the major characters is a very senior intelligence officer, And so, to me, a book that is about one thing, a novel that is about one thing, isn't an attractive one, It's more about a universe in which all kinds of people live and prosper, and what is their relationship? What is the relationship of the middle class to the occupation of Kashmir, or to the fact that Dalits have to convert to Islam or are converting to Islam to get out of castes and so on. So it is a universe in which all kinds of people exist. It's not, and I'm completely with you about this kind of poverty porn that people do get involved with, in which there are a lot of crime, poverty porn that happens in Bollywood and so on. But this is not about that. And as for the lists, that's an interesting question. I honestly haven't thought about it, but clearly I do love them. And I suppose it's a nice way of, a staccato way of moving through a landscape, Yeah, maybe a kind of poetry.
I'm just going to apologize at the top because my head is spinning and it's not every day that you get to meet your heroes. So, just at the top, I just want to say thank you. What do you say to a writer in whose words you've sought shelter at the difficult points in your life? So thank you for the stories that have come through you and from you. Thank you. And then I just want to run through a couple of questions quickly, but just one politically. As somebody who's written about Gandhi, and obviously a lot about India, what do you think about the way in which this country sees Gandhi? You've written about his anti-black racism, yet we still have a Gandhi Square in South Africa. The veneration of Gandhi in this country, what do you make of it? And as far as you know the Indian community in this country, what do you make of that? And then I want to just ask a personal question, as advice for young writers, what would you say? And lastly, I just want to ask, at this time, at this particular point in history, where there's this rise of right-wing fascism, where your own country, India, is being run by a fascist BJP, where that BJP has protested outside your house, what gives you hope? What allows you to overcome the fear of all of these people who want to hurt you for your ideas, for speaking truth to power? What allows you to overcome fear and keep hope alive? Thank you.
Well, I've written a little, either a long essay or a little book called The Doctor and the Saint. It's about the debate between Gandhi and Dr. Ambedkar, who was one of the finest intellectuals of modern India, and a leader of, at that time, people who used to be known as untouchables, but today are called Dalits. And that essay has a large section on Gandhi in South Africa. When I started to write about the debates on caste and Gandhi's position on caste, which was extremely regressive, he referred to caste as the genius of Hindu civilization. And I started to trace this backwards and came to read a lot of his writing when he was in South Africa. And I was taken aback because none of it really makes its way into what we are taught, or the sort of myth around him. I'm wary of saying things because I've written them down, and most of what I wrote are quotes, direct quotes from his own writing, the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. I know that there are tensions now, between communities here, and it's not my intention to light any fires at all. But I do think that we need to relook at Gandhi, and I think we need to relook at him honestly, because he was a man born in India. Initially we used to all joke about why did Gandhi have to come all the way to South Africa to find injustice, because Ambedkar, Ambedkar found it in his own classroom when he was made to sit on a sackcloth on the corner. And then I found that Gandhi's prejudices about caste he brought with him to South Africa. He never viewed the Indian community as a homogeneous community. He made a great separation between the lower castes, between the indentured labor and the passenger Indians, who he said were Aryans and, closer to, and claimed a brotherhood with white people. He often referred to Africans as Kafirs and savages. He campaigned for separate prisons for Indians and blacks. And when he went back from South Africa, he fought with the British in the Zulu rebellion. He fought with the British in the Boer War. And when he went back to India, 1914, 15-ish, he first went to England, where he was given the Kaiser-e-Hind, which is the highest civilian award for service to the empire, before he landed in India to be greeted by India's richest industrialists, the Birlas and the Tatas. And then the story goes from there about how he basically opposed Ambedkar at every step, And so the thing is, he was a consummate politician, and there were things about him that were brilliant, particularly later on when he, when you're talking about sustainable development and so on. However, he was still talking about that, but always sponsored by the biggest industrialists, always supporting the big dams and, negotiating with the industrialists against mill workers and so on. So I have quoted him from the time he was here right up to the time he died, and he's a problematic figure who, most of the world knows about him through Attenborough's film, which is really a piece of fiction, and it does need to be looked at, not resentfully, angrily, not with the idea of just trashing him, but of nuancing this very important figure and really moving him out of the way to allow something. I keep saying in India, if you come to India, it's not Gandhi's picture that you will find in the house of the poorest of the poor. It's Ambedkar's photograph, not Gandhi's, So we do have to be mindful of an industry that has grown around him and falsified a lot of things, and to be mature about it, not to just. I was sad to learn what I learned about his relationship to caste, his relationship to race, and above all, his relationship to women, what would we say today to a man who made his nieces lie in bed with him so that he could check his own sexual responses,
Just a question. I'm very curious. You write about specific battles in India, and I'm very curious to know, what do you consider to be the biggest problem facing humanity at the moment, and what can we do to fix that?
Today, as a young man just pointed out, I have not been more worried about what's happening there as I am now, and even to answer, one of the first ladies who asked the question, you see today in India how corporate capitalism and Hindu nationalism are embodied in the politics of Narendra Modi. In 2002, he was appointed, in 2001 actually, soon after 9/11, he was appointed the chief minister of Gujarat at the time when Islamophobia rose in the West. By February, a train with Hindu pilgrims in it was burnt, and about 60 pilgrims were burnt to death. Nobody knows who set that train on fire. And subsequently, there was a pogrom in the state of Gujarat against Muslims, where tens of thousands were driven from their homes. Between 1,000 and 2,000 were massacred on the streets. Nobody knows the exact number because the bodies were so mutilated and burnt. Women were raped and killed. And just a few months after that pogrom, many corporate CEOs came together and endorsed him as a future candidate for prime ministership. So when he fought the elections to become prime minister, you know, the saffron nationalist clothes came off and a business suit came on. But today, you see how both these things are so closely linked. And that's what I meant when you have to understand caste and race and capitalism together to make sense of it all, you know. And we are living in a time when Muslims and Dalits are being lynched by mobs on the streets, as people are being driven out of the economic arena, and as jobs are being lost, the rage is being recirculated as Hindu nationalism. We have elections coming up. All of us are waiting for which form the fireball that will descend on us is going to take. I mean, just 4 days ago, a young friend of mine who, you know, just a student really, a Muslim student, was shot at in the most high secure zone in Delhi where many of us hold meetings. And two men claiming to be the assassins have proudly said that they are going to surrender tomorrow as heroes, as people who are proud to be killing anti-nationals. And the police haven't arrested them, though they have claimed that they are the ones who did the assassination, because the surrender is going to be a kind of victory parade, you know? So it's a very frightening time right now. I don't know how it's going to turn, but one way of reading it is that these are signs of desperation because they know that they might lose the elections. But even if they do, they will be unleashed. There is a kind of poison being dripped into the veins of the body politic right now.
My question comes from your book. When Anjum is born, her mother wonders a lot of things, and the question comes to her, is it possible to live outside language? And being from a place and in a place where so many languages thrive and clash and are in conflict, have you found an answer to that question?
Well, I think the answer to that question is no. It's not possible to live outside of language, you know, because the desire to communicate, even if it's a language that you communicate with non-humans, with animals, is still a language that you seek. And the need to communicate is I would say, almost like the need to breathe, you know. So when people are excluded from language, it is a very violent thing. And in India's, I mean, as I said, is a continent more than a country. So we have 30 languages accepted in the Constitution, 40 more waiting to be recognized. 780 known languages. And it's an ocean of language in which one swims, you know. So I have said that sometimes I felt like there are many, many languages in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, and the characters are even translating for and to each other, because that's how we live there. And so I did consider saying the Ministry of Utmost Happiness translated from the original by Arundhati Roy, you know.
And it's interesting, you told me just now that this book has been translated into 47 languages.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
infinite number.
You know, a lot of your work centers around actually your non-fiction work, and I find a lot of what you say pretty much a critique on capitalism. I wanted to ask you, I don't really know if you associated to any political party, but where do I see your economic views, or at least which authors do you refer to when you see an economic view for the world?
Honestly, I mean, obviously there are authors that I refer to in my writing, which you can read, but I see it unfolding before my eyes, you know. In 1990, India opened its markets to global capital. I mean, South Africa, and the end of apartheid and the beginning of structural adjustment coincided for you. For us, we had like 45 years of sort of state infrastructure building before neoliberalism came in. And now you see, I mean, you don't have to refer to authors. You can see how, for example, in the 50 years since independence, before 1990, you had nominal land reforms, land redistribution, all of which is being reversed in the new corporate world, you know, where feudalism is now being replaced by kind of corporatization, where corporations are now owning those huge pools of land. Disadvantaged communities and castes began to get a toehold into the education system through the system of affirmative action. Now that is being completely finished off by the privatization of higher education, the privatization of health, the privatization of even water and electricity now. Very similar to the battles that you face here, but you know, you can see it happening before your eyes. You can see how injustice is being celebrated and worshipped in the name of capitalism.
Studying architecture and understanding space, how has that influenced your writing and literature? And understanding that part, how do you think language and literature can help us understand our space? Because living in South Africa as an Indian who studied architecture, the way I grew up at home and understanding the way I understand space and my community is very different to the way that I was taught, and is very different to the way we practice, which creates a whole different sort of friction in the world. So how do we start taking that sort of anti-colonial aspect of how we love, translating it into architecture and space, and also moving forward and progressing, if that makes sense?
So the question was about how architecture, the study of architecture affects the way I write, and how the way I write could affect the way we look at space around us. You know, when I studied architecture, by the time I was in third year, I began to be more interested in cities, and the, you know, we have the colonial part of the city, the medieval part of the city, and the new modern parts of the city in a place like Delhi. And so my architecture thesis was about how cities came to be the way they are and what they do to those who live in it. And the thing was, how do the institutions in the city exclude the poor, you know? So there was a city for citizens, and then there were the non-citizens who live in the cracks between these institutions. And I remember, you know, of course I was like 20 years old then, and facing a jury and telling them that, you know, like this, even the sewage system doesn't belong to the poor because they shit on top of it. And the jury was like, that's enough from you, you know, like you can go. But so for me, this is a fascinating, you know, how architecture and urban architecture uses space to include and exclude, how, and if you read the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, you'll see how clearly that happens in a city like Delhi, you know. And today you see the ghettoization of certain communities. So for example, coming back to the colonial view of how I write, often particularly critics in the West will call my work magic realism. And I say, just because it's not your realism doesn't mean it's magic realism, you know? So I said, give me an example from the Ministry of Utmost Happiness of what you consider to be magic realism. So they said, you know, like these people who live in graveyards and run guest houses. I said, shall I show you photographs, you know? I mean, the cover of the book is a picture of a grave of an unknown person in the dargah of Hazrat Nizamuddin. And there are two women who sleep on either side of this grave and have slept there for like 30 years. Graveyards are becoming the new ghettos in some ways, you know, because obviously in India, the Hindu community cremates its dead. They don't have graveyards, so graveyards are Muslim spaces mostly, or Christian spaces, and the poor do live in graveyards, and that is now an urban space, you know. So Anjum, the character, one of the main characters in the book, she's a hijra, a trans woman who is also born to a Shia Muslim family, and her more dangerous identity in India is that of a Muslim today. She gets caught up in the Gujarat massacre because she's a Muslim, escapes because she's a hijra, and they believe that killing hijras brings them bad luck. And eventually she moves into a graveyard and slowly begins to enclose graves and builds a guest house there where she lives. And she steals her electricity from the morgue because it's right next to a hospital, the graveyard. And for this reason, she has 24 hours electricity, which even the poshest colonies don't have because, you know, even the city's derelict dead have to have electricity so that the corpses don't rot. So these are ways in which urban space is used, you know, what goes on around mosques, what goes on in the communities that are being ghettoized, what goes on in the city that was built by Lutyens for the British Empire and so easily taken over now by the new rulers as if it was made for them, you know. And that's part of how I write and part of why I believe that writing novels is a way of practicing architecture.
Arundhati, you want to end the evening with a final reading. Is there anything else you'd like to say or add before you do that?
No, just that it's been an absolute pleasure to be here, and that in the few days that I've been in South Africa, speaking to journalists who interviewed me, I was speaking to them and they were speaking to me, and it was such an interesting conversation about what's going on here and what's going on there, so similar and so different. And it really enriched my understanding of many, many things. So thank you. So I'm going to read about the city, actually. It's just for 5 minutes, from a chapter called The Nativity. It was peacetime, or so they said. All morning, a hot wind had whipped through the city streets, driving sheets of grit, soda bottle caps, and beady stubs before it, smacking them into car windscreens and cyclists' eyes. When the wind died, the sun, already high in the sky, burned through the haze, and once again the heat rose and shimmered on the streets like a belly dancer. People waited for the thunder shower that always followed a dust storm, but it never came. Fire raged through a swathe of huts huddled together on the riverbank, gutting more than 2,000 in an instant. Still the amalthas bloomed, a brilliant, defiant yellow. Each blazing summer it reached up and whispered to the hot brown sky, "Fuck you." She appeared quite suddenly a little after midnight. No angels sang, no wise men brought gifts, but a million stars rose in the east to herald her arrival. One moment she wasn't there, and the next, there she was on the concrete pavement in a crib of litter, silver cigarette foil, a few plastic bags, and empty packets of Uncle Chips. She lay in a pool of light under a column of swarming, neon-lit mosquitoes, naked. Her skin was blue-black, sleek as a baby seal's. She was wide awake but perfectly quiet, unusual for someone so tiny. Perhaps in those first short months of her life, she had already learned that tears, her tears at least, were futile. A thin white horse tethered to the railing, a small dog with mange, a concrete-colored garden lizard, 2 palm-striped squirrels who should have been asleep, and from her hidden perch, a she-spider with a swollen egg sac watched over her. Other than that, she seemed to be utterly alone. Around her, the city sprawled for miles, 1,000-year-old sorceress, dozing but not asleep, even at this hour. Gray flyovers snaked out of her Medusa skull, tangling and untangling under the yellow sodium haze. Sleeping bodies of homeless people lined their high, narrow pavements, head to toe, head to toe, head to toe, looping into the distance. Old secrets were folded into the furrows of her loose parchment skin. Each wrinkle was a street, each street a carnival, each arthritic joint a crumbling amphitheater where stories of love and madness, stupidity, delight, and unspeakable cruelty had been played out for centuries. But this was to be the dawn of her resurrection. Her new masters wanted to hide her knobby varicose veins under imported fishnet stockings, cram her withered tits into saucy padded bras, and jam her aching feet into pointed high-heeled shoes. They wanted her to swing her stiff old hips and reroute the edges of her grimace upwards into a frozen, empty smile. It was the summer Grandma became a whore. Thank you.